Okay, so hi, my name is Jade, and what we'll be doing today is building off of what Bobby covered last week in React 1. Sorry, I was hearing echo for a second. Okay, so the gist of what we're doing is coding a to-do app. So as you can see here, there's an input space to enter in any task you want. So let's just do something like study. And once you click create task, it'll be added to the list on the right. And then you can conditionally render these as completed or not by clicking on them, or you can click on them again. But if you click on them, you can cross things out and uncross things out. So that's with CSS, as I'll show you later on. So let's get started with our empty create React app. And as you can see here, it says edit src/app.js and save to reload. So we can go back to our files, app.js, and everything that's already here, we can just take it and delete it for now. And we can put something random of our own, like maybe a div. And I don't think my extension's working, but close it up and just type something like hello world. And see if it's working. Okay, save. And as you can see, the changes are immediately reflected in our app. So now we can get building this. So what this will consist of is one main form containing both these components. Technically, you could make them separate, but just for the sake of this tutorial, I'll make them together in the same component. So we can go ahead and do that. In src, you can go ahead and create to-do form.js. And another thing to note is that right now I'm just putting everything in src, but in more complex applications, you can create different folders for different components and group them together that way for better organization. But since it's just so small, I'm just going to do it here. And what it'll be doing is creating a functional component. So the syntax to do so is, well, first, we have to import React. And I'm just going to use shortcuts. So that's IMR and then tab. If you don't have them, I believe this is just installed on VS Code. But if you don't have them, I recommend looking at extensions. Since I have so many that just complete code snippets for you or format things prettier. So yeah, I would look into those if you don't have this. So import React. And there's different syntaxes to create functional components. There's function, and what we'll call the component is form. And then the parameter list and the body. Another way you could do it is by storing it in a variable. So const form equals parameter list and then arrow function to the body. But we'll just use the first one. And then what we need to do for app.js to be able to access this component is export it. So what we do is just at the end of the file, export default and the name of the component. What you can do is do the export up here in line. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'll just put it down below. And sometimes you might need to wrap this component in something else, like, I don't know, some kind of class here and then just wrap it. So that's why I do it separately sometimes. So here we need to return something to be rendered, and we can just do something random again. So like another div and call that form goes here. Save. Okay. And then go back to app.js. And now we need to import this component in our main app. So how we would do that is using import. And then what we want to call it is just form. And then the way we import it, since to-do form is in the same directory as app.js, it's just // and then the name of the file. So to-do form. But like for JavaScript, I don't know why it's giving me errors. Import can only be used in TypeScript. Save. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So it's // to look in the same directory as app.js, and you don't need the .js extension at the end. You notice for SVG and SCSS, other files, you do need them. So this is something to be cautious of. And now we can just render that in our div. There we go. And we see form goes here. So now we can go back to do form.js and create the form. So this is basically like a standard HTML form. So if you're not familiar with the syntax, I recommend reviewing it. What happens in an HTML form is you create a form element to wrap everything inside the form in. And what we want in our form is an input, a button, and a label. So we can go back here and do an input. Actually, it can be self-closing. And we can give it a type of text. So what this does, it creates a text field for you to input things. And what's actually cool is you can put different types, like, for example, maybe password. And instead of that, everything just now is hidden from you, like a standard password input box. So anyways, we can go back to text and then give it a placeholder text of something like enter task here. Save. So now when there's nothing in the box, we see that placeholder text. And then what we want to do is give it an ID. And let's just say something like to do. And the reason we use this ID is so that we can map a label to it. So that's this element, enter task here. So we can go back and create a label. And close that. Enter task here. Oh, sorry. Okay. So in HTML, it would just be label for.id. So to do, except in React, they want you to make a distinction between for and it might be the for loop or something, but either way in React it's HTML for to connect them. And then we can save it to see. There we go. And now we need a submit button. There's two ways of doing this. You can do another input and type equals submit. But what I'll do is just create a button. And if the button is inside the form or is wrapped by a form, then that button will automatically be tied to submission. So we can just go ahead, create a button, and do create task. And then to format it, what I'm doing is Alt-Shift-F. It might be an extension, but I think it should be installed already. So there we go. Now we can see that. So are there any questions so far? There's only like 3 of us, I think. So feel free to just stop at any time, ask any questions. What does the ID mean again? Okay, so what we do with the ID here is we can, so we give an ID to the input so that we can map that to the label. I guess like you can think that it's not that important, but the reason why we want a label is for like accessibility reasons. For example, if you have so many different text boxes, for someone who can't see the screen and they're using a screen reader, all they see are different like text boxes. That's why it's useful to have an ID to kind of identify which text boxes correspond with what. So it's kind of like that. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. So if there's no further questions, the second part we need to do is create the list. And if we go back here and see, so there's one grouping here of the form, and there's another grouping here, which is the list. So the way we can group things together is by creating a div. And I'll just put something like an H1. What was this? To-do list? Okay. To-do list. Shift F, save. Okay. And now we can see that. Something you want to know is, well, let me just take this out and see what happens. React will complain because JSX expressions must have one parent element. So you can't return both a form and a div. you need to have something wrapping it. So you can do that with a div, or there's something else in React called React fragments, which just look like that. And that works too, even though it looks like it's complaining. So we can just keep div. Save. Okay, now that's there. Now we need to have some tasks to display. And what we'll do for now in the beginning, how do I make my cursor Undertale themed? Okay, so I installed, oh, sorry, I'll get to this after the tutorial. We can hard code in the tasks by creating a array of strings, which represent a task. And how we would add tasks to that array is just by appending to that array. So to keep track of states, what we can do is use the hook useState. And it's in curly braces because this is div. I suck at English. I do not know what ubiquitous means. I'm sorry. So we would destructure useState from the React object. Okay, how pervasive. Honestly, divs are very like pervasive, prevalent everywhere. Because they're like the basics of what you would do for grouping things. So if you go on any other website, like sometimes all you see are just like divs and divs and divs and divs and divs. So they're very like prevalent everywhere. There has been like a shift recently to rename divs to more semantic HTML, such as like footer, different tags, so that it's more descriptive for people who are using a screen reader. But divs are very important. Let's see. Sorry. So back to where I was. We destructure. Is it equivalent to a curly brace? Let me think. I guess you could use it that way, but this is HTML. So I guess you could if you wanted to. Because the thing is, with curly braces, you're not really rendering anything, but with the HTML div, you would be. I guess if you wanted to use it as a wrapper, I guess it is equivalent, but the things inside it will be rendered. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm sorry. Okay. So we are destructuring useState from React. Okay. So what we'll do is go to the useState hook. So this is called a hook, by the way. And what this does, it returns an array of two elements, the state object and the function to update that state. So unlike in class-based components, you could have multiple state objects, as you'll see later. And what you pass in to the useState is the default value. So we can go back here in our code and create a state to store the tasks. So tasks, or sorry, syntax is tasks, and then a function to update tasks, and then useState. And does anyone have any suggestions for any tasks we can hard code in here? I might as well just do task 1, task 2, save. So now we have an array of tasks stored in our states. Okay. So now we want to render them. And there's different ways of doing that. A less efficient way is to just create an LI. And in JSX, if you want to use JavaScript, you need to enclose them in curly braces. So that's why I'm doing that and then doing tasks 0, something like that. And then how I get the other line is Alt-Shift-Down arrow, task 1, save. So now we can see these rendered. But this is very inefficient because, one, we need to know exactly how many tasks are there. And also, if you had like hundreds of tasks, like it would be hard to just reference them one by one. So what we can do instead in JavaScript is iterate through the array using map. So this is another concept Bobby covered. So what this does is it iterates through an array. It can accept a function as a parameter and calls that function on every element in the array. And in our case, we're using it to render each member of the tasks array. So let's go back here. And so we need curly braces because we're using JavaScript. Okay. And then we can do tasks.map. And then for every task in the state, we want to return. You can do, okay, there's two ways of doing this again. There's explicit return, which is something like return, and then there's a body here or something like that. But what I'll just be doing is an implicit return inline, since it's just one thing that I want to do. So just create an li with the task that's in state. Save. So now we can go back to our app, refresh, and it's there again. But this way we did it more efficiently by putting them in a map. Okay. Any questions so far? So now what we can do is create a task component to render these tasks. Technically, you could do this in the form as well, but I kind of wanted to show you guys how to pass props through to children, and also just wanted to make things as modular as possible. So go to the src, create task.js. And here I would start it off the same way as I did to do form. So imr, and then function task, parameter list, body, export default, task, and then return, I guess I'll return LIs. For now, they'll just say task. Save. Alt Shift F to format, save again. Okay. Now we can go back here, and there's actually a trick to importing things, but this is something you have to double check. Or there's multiple tricks that I want to talk about for VS Code. So one of them is if you want to have multiple cursors, you can do Alt and Alt click, and then now you can select two of them at once. Another way you could have done this is by selecting the text you want to replace, and then I think it's Control D to select the next instance of matching text. And again, you can just delete. So what I wanted to show you is if you start typing in the name of that component, VS Code will want to automatically import it for you. So I'll just press Tab, and you can see that it's added on the top. So instead of having to write this manually, it automatically does it for you. But this is something to like double check, because sometimes the paths can be wrong if you have like multiple files of the same name, something like that. Okay. So now we can save, and that changes everything to task because we are not passing in the strings to this component. So how we would do that is passing props, and what we can do is pass in a prop called task, or to do, I'll just call it task. Task equals the task in state. And we don't actually need that anymore, so we can just make this a self-closing element. Save. And right now it's not doing anything because we're not extracting this data. So we can, just for now, console.log the props object just to see what we're getting from the parent component. So console.log props. Save. Okay. Inspect. Console. Okay. So we're getting two objects that correspond to task 1 and task 2. You can see in each of these objects, there's a task property, and we want to be able to extract that. And we can do that by destructuring. And I have a slide on that. So what this does, it allows for extraction of data from an array or object and assigns them to their own variables. So instead of being like person.name or person.major, you can just extract the name and major from the person object and just refer to it as name and major. So what we can do here is destructure tasks, or was it task? It's task. Destructure task from the props, and we can put the task here. Save. Okay. And instead of seeing task, we now see task 1 and task 2 like we did before. So console.logging is really useful for debugging. It's just something else to keep in notes. And now what we want to do is tie the inputs to the list. And how we do that is make a state to keep track of the inputs. So we can go back to task or to do form.js and create const inputs and then update inputs equals use state. And the default value of input is just blank. So save. And are there any questions so far? Okay. So how our code knows when exactly we want to save the input to the list is by using something called events. So how we'll keep track of input or update the input is whenever this text box changes, we can update the value of inputs. So how we do that is using the onChange event. So to the text box, I can attach an onChange attribute. And then this takes in a function with the event as the parameter. And we can create an arrow function here and update input to be what is entered. So you can console.log e just to see what it is, but I know the value of the input is going to be e.target.value. But again, it is helpful for debugging to console.log e to see what exactly you need to select. And at the bottom here, we can just create an H1 for testing and put the input below. Save. So now when we enter something, you can see that it's reflected in the H1 below. So every time this changes, we can see the H1 changing as well because the event is onChange. So now we can take this out. And what we want to do is only when we click this button or submit the form, we want to add the task to the list. So how we would do that is by using onSubmit. What you could do is create like an onClick property on the button, but since like this is a form, it automatically has an onSubmit feature. I could just do that. So form onSubmit equals, and the way I did it down here was I did it all inline. But to show you another syntax, I want to make another function. So onSubmit equals handle submit, which is a function we will create. Const handle submit equals takes in the e parameter, arrow function. And okay, so let me show you what happens right now, I guess. So if I click create task, you see how the whole thing is trying to refresh. And we don't want that because that's just going to erase everything we put in our list as well. So we need to e.prevent default, which is the refresh of the page. And then we can update tasks. And how we update the tasks is we want to copy everything that was already in the tasks array and add in the new inputs. And how you would do that in an easy way is by using the spread operator. So it allows you to take an object or array and separate each one into separate arguments. So there's many applications, including copying or combining, arrays or objects, the states. So what this does is it takes everything in the pets array the cat and the dog, copies it in, and adds the bunny. So in our code, what we can do is spread out the tasks so we get the first two, and then at the end, attach our input. Save, go back. So now when we click something like DDDD, it's there, study. Yeah, basically, it's there. And just for something that's nice to have, like it would be nice to reset the input whenever you click submit. And how you would do that is just update input just to a value of nothing. And down in the input, you need to tie the whatever's in the text field, the value of it, to input as well. So value equals input. Save. So now when you click enter, it's automatically submitted to the list. Does anyone need a few minutes to catch up? Okay, so now we can move on to the conditional rendering part. This app is still running, yeah. So that's toggling whether or not it's completed. So how we do this is by using CSS classes. So there's a class that kind of marks the task as complete, and there's a class that marks it as incomplete. And we can do that in app.css. I'm just creating, or sorry, I'm deleting everything default in here already and creating my own classes, complete and incomplete. So in complete, we can do text decoration of line through for the strike through. Incomplete, well, just to make a distinction, I'll just do color. Complete is green usually. Incomplete is red. Okay. And right now it does nothing because the classes aren't attached to our code. And well, first of all, you might be like, why don't we need to import it? And the thing is we do, it's already imported for us. So this is something you need to be careful of. And we don't need to import it again in task.js where we'll be using it because task.js is a child of app.js. And that's so everything that's a child of app can see the app.css. So we can go back to task.js and create a state that allows us to keep track of whether the task is completed or not. So again, we can destructure use state. And now we can create a state that's complete and update completion equals use state. And the default state will just be false because it's incomplete. Okay. F. And now what we can do is whether or not it is completed, we can assign the class CSS class of complete or incomplete. And we can do that using something called the ternary operator. So what this does is the condition, and if the condition is true, then it assigns it a class of, a class name of complete. And if it's false, then it assigns a class name of incomplete. And you notice here that in HTML, it's just class equals, but in React, it's class name because the developers wanted to make a distinction between class-based components and the class for CSS. So let's go back to our code and go back to task.js, give it a class name equals. So if it is completed, then we want to give it a class name of complete. If not, then incomplete. F, save. So right now, everything should be incomplete and it does show up as red. If we want to be able to toggle them, then we can do an onClick function to handle the click and toggle the value of completion. So you can do here onClick equals, and I'm just going to create the function inline So on click equals, there's no parameters for this. And then what we want to do is update completion to the opposite of what it is right now. Shift F, save. And now that if we click on it, you can see it being marked as complete. And you might be like, there's no reason to make another class for incomplete because that's just the default state. So if we take this out, or we don't even need to take this out, but if we just wanted to be able to render things as complete or not, there's another shorthand you can do, which is just the and. Let's see here. Okay. And it's just, the reason why it works is because of JavaScript early termination. So it checks if the first condition is true. And if and only if the first condition is true, the second thing will be run. So if and only if the task is completed or is completed is true, then the class name of complete will be assigned to it. So we can just save, go back, and now we can see the default state and also our toggling. Okay. So are there any questions on what we've done so far? And okay, so I was going to go over routes. I guess I could go over routes for a few minutes before we wrap up. So I'll just show you what's been going on. So I will uncomment the code that includes router. So this is just the example code that I showed at the beginning, save, and fresh. So now you can see that there's two links here, to do and some random components. You can toggle back and forth between the to do and some random component, and the URL changes as well. So you might be wondering, like, what's the difference between using this link and an A tag? And the difference between that is server-side versus client-side routing. Server-side routing is kind of inefficient because we need to do a full refresh of the page for something simple like just changing a component. Meanwhile, for client-side routing, you just change what you see on the page. And what I mean by that is the request to the server is prevented, so less data is processed and refreshed and making it faster. And there's different pros and cons to each method, but I just wanted to show you how to use a library called React Router DOM, as you might need it in your QWeb project. So how you would install this project is do npm I and the react-router-dom. So it's just like in the terminal when you put create React app, you just do the npm I there. And then in your index.js, see, you would import React Router DOM and extract what you need from it in each file. So in the index, you want to wrap your whole app in what's called a browser router. So that's basically what I have here, import browser router, and just wrap the app in that. Okay. And then now we can go to app.js where you see, sorry, that's the wrong app.js, where you see I've destructured the routes, navigate, and link. So to create a route to either the to-do or some random components, I create a path, or sorry, I create a route with the path that I want. So you can see here it says page in the path, and in the URL, it also says page because I set it to be that way. And if the URL is page, then I want to render the page component. Same with the to-do form. And the way that, well, okay, so one way we can switch between them is just to type it in ourselves. But obviously, our clients won't know exactly what to type in, so we want to create links to them. And the way we do that is create the link to the same path that we have down here and just give it a label of something. So that way we can switch back and forth between different routes. So you might think this is like really trivial for this example, except when you're doing your QWeb projects, you might be making something like a homepage for a club, and they would have an about page, a contact us page, and multiple other pages that you want to just switch through. So that'd be a perfect application for routes. So just to wrap things up, I'll be discussing our mini projects. Okay. So the goal is to create just a simple grocery list. And just like what I've shown here, I want you guys to create a simple form with a label, an input field to enter in a grocery item, and a submit button. And when the user hits submit, the data will be rendered on the page, like what was shown in the tutorial. So just like this. Okay. And you can just style them as you like, using what you know from HTML, CSS, and you already kind of know how to link the styles to the CSS file. Let's see if I can go find Node.js. Yeah, okay, so the way you would link the classes from CSS to React is by using class name and then give it the class. So that's basically all I had for this tutorial. Thank you guys for coming. So if there's any other questions, please let me know. And yeah.